Hi, everyone, and welcome back to World History Before 1500 or until 1500. Today, I have my Mongol beard slash coronavirus beard going for you so that we can talk about the Mongols, one of my favorite subjects to talk about in a world history course, and a very interesting group that changed world history in very important ways while still being one of those groups that comes from a place, and we just talked about this in our short response last week, that was kind of a gray area of the map, kind of off the map until the Mongols showed up. So they are a fascinating story, one of only a few such stories of a group that comes from one of these less established areas in world history with a smaller population, less density, less advanced cities and technology, at least some technologies, and ends up taking over and creating their own new empire and changing the world in a global way with this serious political impact that you do not normally see, at least from the perspective of the center of these more populated areas from these gray areas of the map. However, you could say other people and places that were previously gray also had taken over, things like the Greeks, as we saw very early in the term, these sea peoples who invaded into Egyptian civilization and the cradle of civilization, and would later become players on the world stage themselves. So there's a precedent for this kind of thing happening, but at the same time, the Mongols are acting on a scale that is unprecedented in terms of creating a vast land empire, especially coming from an area that is less known to the rest of the world and less known to history in general. So today we're going to talk about the Mongolian Empire. We're going to talk a little bit about Yuan China, the Chinese dynasty that is headed by the Mongols, that is led by the Mongols. Although really I'm having you read about that more than I'm going to talk to you about it. A little bit about the Mongol invasions of Japan, a fascinating story. I won't go too far into depth on that. And also the Silk Road under the Mongols. And we're going to learn, of course, about Genghis Khan, his grandson Kublai Khan, the two greatest of the great Khans, and the processes by which the Mongols end up taking over the bulk of both Asia and, in fact, Europe. Um, Today's readings are a little bit different before I jump right in here. The readings I'm giving you are actually from an East Asian history textbook. It's East Asia Cultural, Social, and Political History. I've used this textbook many times in the past, multiple editions of it. Boy, it's dark here. And I have, kind of a lot of respect for this textbook. There we go. There's a little bit more light in my face. And this is a great book for studying Asia. So especially for the Mongols, I think this book does maybe a little bit better job than our textbook does. And you can still read the sections of our textbook on the Mongols if you want another opinion or another viewpoint. But just to give you a little bit more detail from an Asianist perspective, I think is a good idea to understand the Mongols. So I've assigned to you two chunks of one chapter here: China under Mongol rule and Connections the Mongols. You can find both of these in our documents folder on Google Drive now. I've just uploaded them. So if you see here, documents number 8 and 9 are your readings that you should read either before or just after you watch this lecture. Either way is probably fine. But let's go ahead and get my face out of the way here. I think this image is very interesting, this photograph of obviously people reenacting the kind of activities that the Mongol horde or Mongol warriors were known for, which is horseback-based warfare, mounted archery, which was very common across Asia, throughout what you'd call medieval history, perhaps the 10th through 18th centuries or so, across multiple parts of East Asia, China, Japan, and the steppe. But the Mongols were probably the best at it, and this is kind of what they might have looked like relatively close to what they might have looked like way back in the 13th century as they were invading the bulk of Europe and Asia. So let's move into the lecture here. So who was Genghis or Genghis Khan, also known as Temujin? Lived from 1162 to 1227, and who is he now? These are very good questions, but I don't want to delve too deep into this mytho-history or this legendary story of Genghis Khan. The legend, just very roughly stated, is that Genghis Khan, as a very small child, was abducted, probably a preteen. I'm not sure exactly what age he is purported to have been, and held captive by another tribe or clan of Mongols, with much of his clan having lost what was essentially a war between two clans happening up in the steppe. And as he was captured, he learned a great deal about the conduct of warfare and about the difficulties of taking over areas and taking over people. And he vowed both revenge on the clan that had captured him and to one day unite all of the Mongol people together into one great khanate or one great horde. And he was successful in this. Exactly how much of this story is true versus how much of it is kind of embellished to create the image of this great leader is not really known. It's probably relatively true that most of these things happened, although whether or not young Genghis Khan was really plotting to take over the world as he was captured and as his family was killed, that part to me personally seems maybe a little bit less believable, a little bit more difficult to imagine. But anyway, that's the mytho-history. That's the legend of Genghis Khan. And the reality is that he was successful whenever he decided that he was going to take over the steppe and then expand outward as the singular leader of the Mongols. He was successful in doing so, and quite successful. And this whole lecture today, it's titled Pax or Pax Mongolica. I've kind of structured it with this central question of whether or not the Mongols were good or bad, which is kind of a simplistic question, right? And we could also look at whether or not Genghis Khan and those who would follow him were heroes or villains in the story of world history. And it is certainly a matter of perspective, right? If you're one of the people being conquered by the Mongols, especially if you're being, wiped out by the Mongols, certainly they seem to you to be villains. If you're one of the members of the family of Genghis Khan, you're certainly the heroes in your own story. But our job today is to kind of come up with an argument for or against the Mongols in their productivity or destruction or destructivity in world history. And so that's my question to you. And I know it's a simple binary, and of course the answer is that they're both. But I would like you to think about it. And then perhaps in our discussion this week on the discussion board, this is a question that hopefully at least one person will bring up. I'm asking you to do so. Please bring up the question. What do you think about the Mongols? Were they good or bad? Are they heroes or villains? Are they productive or destructive in world history? You can see here one of several large statues of Genghis Khan in Mongolia today, and that he is revered as a great leader in the history of the Mongol people. Mongolia, as you probably know, is not today a particularly politically powerful or economically powerful country. And so the Mongolian people today, the Mongols of today, do look back fondly on a time in world history when they were major players and in fact the most powerful group politically in the world for at least a little bit longer than 100 years. A question that always comes up in both East Asian and world history classes when talking about the Mongols is, what about the Great Wall of China? Why didn't it just stop them? Why were they able to defeat the Great Wall of China when others did not? And the answer is quite complicated and involves a broader question about why the Mongols succeeded. But to try to put it briefly here, The Great Wall of China should really be called, as I've said before, the Great Walls of China's. And in the period of history that we're talking about right now, the Song dynasty being the dynasty that was up against the Mongols and up against Genghis Khan and his children and grandchildren, and it did take 3 generations for them to take over China, but they did do so. This was a period when China was fairly militarily weak, as we've talked about previously, and the Mongols were quite militarily strong, and they were perfectly capable of finding gaps and riding around chunks of the wall, and also of breaching it in some cases, most famously to take what is now Beijing. And so the Great Wall, as I've said previously, is most effective when we don't even know about the people who are trying to get through it. And this is one of the cases in which people were able to get through it. It was not, a magical, impenetrable barrier. You could get through or around the Great Wall in various places, and the Mongols were successful in doing so. A lot of what they were doing to take over China was protracted siege warfare. They did adapt quite a bit over time, and they did have to adapt quite a bit in order to take over, especially the southern Sung. But I'll let you read about some of this in our textbook. But the answer is essentially that while the wall probably helped China to fend off the Mongols, it was not a magic bullet, and it was possible to breach this wall. Talking more broadly about this broader question of why did the Mongols succeed? This is a very good question. It's certainly the case that the people of Mongolia had a much less dense population and a much smaller population from which to draw militarily capable people than the Chinese did. And the classical answer to this question of, why did China not just have a far larger military and wipe them out immediately, is that in the Song dynasty in China, to just throw a number out there, probably 1% or less of militarily capable men would be actually joining the military and participating in the national defense, as you could call it in this case. Whereas in Mongolia, the way of life that people had, this nomadic hunter/pastoralist lifestyle, meant that virtually all people, both men and women alike, were adept at riding horses, at using bows and arrows, at some level of martial prowess. To the point that not only could quite a lot of the people from Mongolia fight, probably most of them could engage in warfare. And while it was an almost exclusively male endeavor to engage in the conquest of other territories, Mongol women could certainly participate in defensive actions at home as necessary. It was not typically necessary, but almost the entirety of the Mongol population, and this is my main point, is capable of fighting. And only a very small minority of the Chinese population is capable or trained in the necessary skills to fight, especially to fight back against the Mongols. So the traditional answer to why were the Mongols able to win, even though they were a much smaller group in terms of population, is that their military population was probably as large or larger than that of a lot of the places they were attacking, including China. And their level of skill, their level of military technology was particularly high. And it was a kind of military activity, this riding of horses, as we saw on the first slide with bows and arrows, where you don't take a lot of casualties when you go fight. This is also the case in medieval Japan, where in early medieval Japan, the way people fight is on horseback with bows and arrows. Very few people actually die in war when they are riding a horse and shooting a bow and arrow. It's easy to get away from your enemy. It's easy to kill someone without really taking any damage yourself most of the time, unless you're shot back at and you're hit. And it's often the case that you're able to have military success while incurring virtually no losses or very few losses. This changes when you run up against walls, when you run up against gated cities, and early on the Mongols simply did not have an answer to siege warfare, to the issue of siege warfare. They would solve this problem later, But early on, most of the territory the Mongols conquered were things like villages or small towns that did not have the fortifications necessary to stop a group of mounted warriors from entering and, kind of killing people and taking over. So why did the Mongols succeed? A big part of it is that they were militarily capable on a vast scale in terms of percentage of their population. This kind of advantage of their abilities, I'm sorry, this second tick should not be here, led to the largest land empire in history. You could call it simply the largest empire in history, although technically, I believe in World War II, the Japanese empire covers more square miles, the bulk of that mileage being the Pacific Ocean. So we do call the Mongol Empire the largest land empire in history, although I think it's also fair to call it simply the largest empire in history. We have some capitals listed here, and you can see that the capitals of the Mongol Empire, my only real point here being, they remain largely in or close to the steppe. They maintain their capital in Beijing or in Xanadu or Karakorum, and these are areas that are close to the Mongol homeland. Even after they take over southern China, they retain power essentially up north, closer to their traditional home. Although they do eventually move their capital to Beijing, to a place that is traditionally Chinese, and establish a new Chinese dynasty called the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan. We'll get back to that in just a minute. Mapping the Mongol Empire, here's a good website from Colombia that has a bunch of different maps if you want to look over some of them, including an animated map that shows the specific growth. This is not, something we're going to go into a lot of detail about, and it's not a military history or a political history of the Mongols per se, but if you want to look at some of these maps, they are quite useful. There will be a lot more maps today. The history of the Mongols features 5 great khans and 4 khanates, and you don't need to remember all of this, but Genghis Khan is the first great Khan, who we've talked about a little bit. He is successful in taking over a vast area of northern China, Central Asia, the Middle East, much of what is now Russia, into the Black Sea and essentially Eastern Europe or Central Europe. He's succeeded by Ogadai Khan, another capable military ruler, and in fact, all of these great Khans they're quite good as rulers overall. Some of them have certain faults, and Genghis and Kublai are seen as the 2 greatest Khans, but Ogadai is an excellent military commander, and after the death of Genghis Khan, there is a brief pause in the expansion of the Mongol Empire. This probably saves Western Europe from conquest, but Ogadai still does a good job of taking over more territory and consolidating the territory that his father had taken. And then Guyuk has only a couple of years of rule, but is particularly successful in taking over more chunks of the Arabic Empire, the Islamic Empire. Monk Khan, another 10 years of relative success, especially in consolidation, in taking over areas, to what is the far west for the Mongols. And then Kublai Khan is the another grandson of Genghis Khan, the ruler really who has the longest reign and who finds success in taking over the Sung dynasty in its totality, who ends the southern Sung Empire and creates a Mongol-led Chinese empire, the Yuan dynasty, which we can see back here, really actually lasts about 100 years, from 1279 to 1368. So for about 100 years, there is a class in China of rulers that is theoretically Mongol or, descended from Kublai Khan. So why are there gaps between each ruler is an interesting question. In between the death of a great Khan and the selection of a new one, there would be a retreat back to the Mongol homeland of at least the leadership of the Mongol military, where the tribal heads would select the next great Khan. And for the first 5 Khans after Genghis Khan, These were all his successors. We have his son Ogadai and then his grandsons Guyokmon and Kublai. But this was still a process that involved deliberation. It involved oracles speaking to the spirits, and various ceremonies and kind of meetings. And so between each of these great khans, there is a pause in military expansion. And like I said a minute ago, this probably saves much of Western Europe. It probably saves parts of the Arabic Peninsula, maybe into Egypt. It's unclear how far the Mongols would have gotten. It may save Japan as well, if they had not had these pauses. But these pauses were also probably quite significant in shoring up political power for the next ruler. So it's hard to say if these were, productive or kind of slowing down the expansion of the Mongol Empire. If you want some further reading on the empire itself, this link is good. It goes to the History of International Relations by Eric Ringmar. It has this wonderful long article. If you want to study the Mongols, perhaps for your source paper, if you can find a good source that you want to work from, this would be a secondary source you could cite. And to talk a little bit about the Khanates. So the death of Genghis Khan didn't end the expansion of the empire, but it did lead to its division eventually into 4 of these great Khanates. And this happens over time. And each of these Khanates is led by a Khan, not a great Khan in the east, in the traditional Mongol homeland, in the steppe, in Korea and China and Tibet, and then by other Khans who are kind of nominally deputies, but largely independent of the great Khan, especially more so over time. And these Khanates gradually adopt a lot of the cultural characteristics, a lot of the practices, religious practices, social practices of the places they move to. So, for example, the Golden Horde, largely in areas of Russia today, ends up adopting imagery, architecture, symbology, and religious elements that are otherwise evidenced in Russian Orthodox Catholicism. In the Ilkhan, there are Khans who convert to Islam, and large chunks of the Mongol population there that convert to Islam. And so they have mosques, Mongol mosques, and Mongol churches in different places. The Chagatai or Chagatai Khanate adopts a lot of Central Asian features, and retains its own character, although it's less distinct than the Ilkhan and the Golden Horde. And the Khanate of the Great Khan is both purely Mongol in the north and very Chinese in the south, having its own Chinese dynasty, and also Korean. And so it's very interesting to study these Khanates as parts of a broader empire that's yet become more distinct in their own right over time. And some of the irony here is that they fall in a kind of unexpected order. The Yuan dynasty collapses before, for example, the Golden Horde, which retains power for much longer than the Chinese are, under Mongol rule. And the kind of Khanate of the Great Khan shrinks in some ways faster than some of the other Khanates in terms of its especially economic significance, I would say, once China is lost. Here's another good map of the Yuan dynasty here. And here's some good timelines for you. So the Yuan dynasty lasts from 1279 to 1368. The Ilkhan in the Arabic Empire lasts till 1353. So it starts a little earlier, ends a little bit earlier than the Yuan dynasty. The Chagatai Khanate has a really high point from 1259 to 1370, but then retains some degree of power until the 17th century. So it outlasts some of these other more dense areas. And the Golden Horde lasts till 1502. Perhaps if you were to pick one that is the most successful for the longest, it might be the Golden Horde. And you could study any of these on their own if you're interested in them for your source analysis paper. So let's get back to the question real quick. Pax or pox, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'll give you some information here, just things that I considered to be particularly important when weighing this question of were the Mongols good or bad. So we have the bad here on the left and the good on the right, and I'll just go through these. I am going to kind of read them to you because I just wrote these down. But so cities and other settlements that refuse to yield to the Mongol hordes. The Mongol horde shows up outside your door on their horses. Eventually, they have siege machines with them, and they bring things like catapults and battering rams and climbing towers to get over your walls. And they say, give up now or we're going to burn your city down. And if you refuse, they will burn your city down and kill everyone inside. And then after the city has burned, they'll go inside and pull out anything of value, precious metals, which won't burn up, and other goods that might not burn up in this fire. So entire populations of people are wiped out because if you refuse the horde, they will kill everyone in your village. They might let one or two people go to tell the next village that they should not resist. However, if you did open your doors and let the Mongols in, they might kill your leader, they might kill a few people, they might not kill anyone at all, and they generally did not seek to change anything about your place. Your home culture, your town, your village, your city would be left intact. You could still practice your religion. It doesn't matter which one. You could still have the same social practices, marriage practices, etc. No problem. The same political structure can remain intact. You just have to occasionally pay the Mongols a tribute or a fee to remain a part of their empire and remain there peacefully. So you could actually get through Mongol conquest relatively unscathed. You'd have to pay, but you could get through it. However, on the bad side again, the Mongol horde was known for its sheer brutality, just for horribly cruel acts, including acts of biological warfare and torture. We'll get back to the biological warfare thing in a minute because it's fairly well known, but they would, set people on fire, drown people, drag them behind their horses, hang them up on the walls to let them starve. And so they're known for being particularly evil to their enemies. Yet, at the same time, after the Mongols conquered areas, those areas became among the safest places in the world to travel, to trade, to spread your religion or spread your philosophy back and forth. And this is especially the case for travelers on the Silk Road. So the Silk Road has existed for over 1,000 years by the time the Mongols come around, and it has always been a relatively treacherous journey. You don't travel the length of the Silk Road safely. Very few people travel far on it. You travel maybe to the next town, and then someone else goes to a town further. But under the Mongols, a series of post stations is established about a day's ride apart. Each day there's a place for you to sleep, kind of a hotel on the road to water your horses or repair your cart, get food, water, other things, other necessities on the trail. And this means that it is safer now under the Mongols, under these horrific, quote unquote barbaric, conquerors, to move across the landscape than ever before. So by being the greatest robbers and bandits in the land, the Mongols have essentially put all of the other robbers and bandits and murderers and thieves out of business. And this is kind of an interesting thing to think about. Also on the bad side, Mongol military tactics were broadly terroristic. So they are, you could think of them as terrorists. They have a reputation that they're trying to cultivate of being evil, of being fearsome, of being someone you don't want to mess with, being deliberately inhumane. And in some cases, they would set civilizations, particularly in places like Iran, back by centuries through the destruction of things like canals, destruction of cities, destruction of other pieces of infrastructure, the destruction of knowledge of books and scrolls, etc., which would of course burn up if they burned your city. And so the Mongols set some places back by centuries. Yet, on the good side, throughout the generations, local Mongol rulers often sought to integrate themselves into their new homes. So they would adopt the religion of the place they moved to, like I've already said. For example, Kublai Khan and in other things, they would also encourage the growth of culture. And for example, Kublai Khan is famous for his love of Chinese opera. And a part of the reason why Chinese opera remains a significant and hugely influential part of Chinese history thereafter is because Kublai Khan was a sponsor of the Chinese opera, and he would have operas put on at the Imperial Palace and in other large public gathering areas for people to come and watch and enjoy. And he promoted this thing that is seen as a quintessentially part of, Chinese culture, and even though he was himself a Mongol or split between the Mongol and Chinese worlds. On the bad side, if towns or cities could not be conquered, the Mongols were known for starving people out. They would divert rivers. They would burn all of the crops and destroy all of the farmland around a city or fortress. And they were happy to starve people out if necessary. And then on the good side, kind of contrary to that, is that areas that agreed to pay the tribute to the Mongols were often fully autonomous. They could still rule themselves, control themselves, and left intact. The Mongols might not even really leave anyone there. They might just come through once a year or so and say, okay, pay your taxes to the Mongols. And in that way, they were not particularly different than any other ruler, and that they were simply gathering a tax. So you could exist under the Mongols without incurring this wrath, but the wrath was still there nonetheless. So pax or pox, once again, the question is up to you. Here's an interesting hot take. So I have the article for you here. I think it's from The Guardian. But there is this theory that Genghis Khan was actually good for the planet because the things he destroyed were hurting the planet, right? So some of the things that Genghis Khan destroyed, including things like cattle, including things like industrial elements of a town or city, were probably damaging the air quality in given places, damaging the atmosphere. And so it is sometimes argued that Genghis Khan may have been an eco-warrior, not on purpose, but inadvertently, probably slowing down things like climate change in his time. And I wonder, given our current crisis of coronavirus, if we can draw some parallels here, because the coronavirus is obviously horrible. It is destructive. It is painful. It is causing human suffering and death. But we see on the news, if you've been watching the news, a lot of these kind of puff pieces or, end of the news hour, happy stories about how things like dolphins are returning to Italy, or the air quality in LA is the best it's been in 50 years. And so sometimes destructive things have unintended positive consequences for the environment, and Genghis Khan may have been one of these. So here's another thing to put in your scales of whether or not there's a pax or a pox Mongolica here. But then on the pox side, the Black Plague, it is often cited, and I have a link for you here to this article that is actually linked by the CDC. The Mongols, in their developments of siege warfare, did eventually begin catapulting or hurling plague-infected cadavers, human cadavers, and also disease-ridden things like horses and cattle into city walls. They did it famously in the Crimean city of Kaffa. And this may have been the world's first, or one of the world's first, occasions of biological warfare. And it may also be a part or a major reason why the Black Plague spread to Europe out of Asia and Eastern Europe, Crimea. So you can read the article here if you're interested in this. But the Black Plague may have inadvertently been spread by the Mongols all the way to Europe and caused a great deal of destruction there. Oh, sorry about the lesson 3 here part. So talking about the Silk Road just for a minute here. And there's a video here I'd really like you to watch, which is very excellent. It's only 5 minutes long. I'm not going to play it because I can't play the sound for you. But this is an excellent video about Dunhuang. And I've mentioned Dunhuang a couple of times in this class, or the Caves of Mogao. But Dunhuang is a fascinating kind of pit stop on the Silk Road in in what is now far western China, in the kind of middle of the desert, where a large set of caves has been discovered to contain Buddhist imagery and Buddhist texts that date back to the age of the Mongols and much earlier. And one set of sources you might consult for your source paper if you're interested in this stuff would be some of the scrolls from Mogao or Dunhuang. And this is one piece of evidence of the safety of the Silk Road, that a place like this could exist under the Mongols and grow under the Mongols, and which we see as a piece of evidence of how substantial some of the stops along the Silk Road could be. There's a real misconception about Central Asia as a transmitter and backwater, and I'm actually quoting a Columbia University professor who says this. I'm sorry, I don't have his name offhand here. And a land of foreign meddling, when in fact, at various points in its history, Central Asia has had a great deal of significance as a source of knowledge generation, especially in traditions like the Buddhist tradition, and as kind of a nexus of sorts of the melding of some of the cultures that move, technically through it on the Silk Road, but in fact meld and mesh along the way. There's also a misconception of the northern steppe, the place the Mongols come from, as an area of purely persistent hostility. And we see this a little bit here in the Mongols, that while they are hostile, it is not a constant raiding and killing all of the time. They are in fact conquering places and then leaving them alone as long as they remain kind of members of the club of the Mongol Empire. We see Korea and Japan continue in quasi-independent development, although Korea is conquered by the Mongols along with China. But they are developing still their own independent cultures that are unique and separate from Chinese or Mongol culture, despite the fact that there are Mongol influences creeping in. Here's another image of the Silk Roads, which we've talked about before, but if you look at this and you look at a map of the Mongol Empire, you'll see that the bulk of this, all the way over to the Black Sea, is encapsulated in the Mongol Empire. So the point I was making earlier about the safety of the Silk Roads under the Mongols is kind of emphasized here, or something I want to emphasize here with these maps. The Mongol Empire kind of covers up most of the Silk Road. Obviously not the water-borne routes, the sea-borne routes of the Silk Road, but the land-borne routes of the Silk Road are largely encompassed by the Mongol Empire. Buddhism spreads again. This is a slide from earlier this term. And here we see once again that Buddhism is moving through the Mongol Empire back and forth. Even though it's already kind of arrived everywhere on this map by the time the Mongols show up, the trading of knowledge continues across the Silk Road. So just because Buddhism has arrived in a place like Japan doesn't mean people from Japan or from other places going to Japan are not still spreading new and changing ideas of Buddhism all throughout Japanese or Silk Road history. So we have the Mongol Empire and Khanates. I think it's a good idea to have pictures here of the two of the greatest Khans, Genghis and Kublai, and their reigns here. So first contradiction is they're really ruthless fighters. They're quote-unquote barbaric, or they're seen as such. They're also highly adaptive. They're adaptive both in terms of their military technology, but also their culture. So they're happy to adopt other religions and allow others to have their religions to gain the kind of social or marriage practices, inheritance practices of the places they move to. They have religious tolerance and respect for local tradition. And they're seeking tribute for places that are also far outside of their local grasp. So although they're seen as these barbarians, they're in fact quite politically adept. They're getting places like Vietnam, Java, Japan, further into Western Europe, and the Middle East to pay tribute. They're not always successful in establishing these tributes, but they have these political ideas that exceed the kind of bare scope of their empire. So we've talked about material culture a little bit, what objects, images, and things like that tell us that words do not. And so I'm giving you an example here of a source from Japan of the Mongol invasions. And the Mongol invasions of Japan, I'll talk about them really briefly because I want to wrap this up fairly quickly here. Of 1274 and 1281, there are two invasions. The first is a huge surprise. No one sees it coming, and the Mongols are successful. And really, it's actually mostly Korean and Chinese conscripts with some Mongol commanders are successful in invading inland into Kyushu, the southern island of Japan. They attack at Hakata, which is one of the major trading ports and kind of the port that you're supposed to arrive to in Japan if you're planning to trade or have some kind of diplomatic or religious connection. And they kind of, breach their way into the city, and they're riding around for, some time before they are finally repelled and pushed back to the sea. And then a great storm comes and washes away many of their boats. This is quite famous. Then in 1281, the Japanese kind of prepare for a second invasion, which they know is planned. They build a fortification in Hakata, a large seawall, essentially, or a large wall on the beach that's about between 6 and 10 feet high, about horse to horse and rider height, in some places a little bit higher, to repel the Mongols when they land and the Mongol conscripts as they land. And this scroll depicts that second invasion. And this is someone called Takezaki Suenaga, who is pictured here on the right, fighting bravely against these obviously quite barbaric looking invaders. And you can see, if you're looking at what images tell us that words do not, you can see how the Japanese think of these invaders. They look almost non-human, almost demonic, or like maybe like Neanderthals or something, whereas the Japanese are quite human looking. And so from this image, you can see that the Japanese are fighting and dying in battle, that there are things like fire bombs, bows and arrows, shield walls, pikes, etc. being used. And this scroll itself is quite interesting. And there's a whole book that's been written about it. And there's a great little website here, the Mongol Invasions of Japan. There's a whole book by someone called Tom Conlon called In Little Need of Divine Intervention, that talks about this, the invasions and the scroll in particular. This scroll is created by Takezaki Suenaga so that he can be paid for his service. And the Mongol invasions, although they are not successful in taking over Japan, do have a huge impact on Japanese history because this is the first major battle for the samurai, wherein after they are victorious, after they've won, there's nothing to really pay them with. Because traditionally, wars in Japan were civil wars, right? They were happening all within Japanese soil, and the winners would take over the land of the losers. So you kind of automatically have a payment built into your service as a warrior. In this case, you're fighting off people from abroad, and when you kill them, there's no land to take over. There's nowhere to go to gain your reward. So Takezaki Suenaga makes this scroll to say, hey, I fought, I lost a horse, I was injured, many of my friends were injured, some of my footmen may have died, and you need to pay me for my service. You need to give me some land somewhere or pay me some money in order, or some rice perhaps, whatever he would have asked for, in order to kind of assure that I'm going to keep serving you in the future. And the Japanese government, the warrior government in Kamakura, is not able to really pay all of the warriors who participate in these battles. And it causes, eventually, kind of an economic catastrophe or crisis for the Kamakura warrior government, and is certainly one factor that leads to its collapse about 40 or 50 years later, about 50 years later. And so these scrolls are quite interesting because although the Mongols fail, and once again they're driven out by the Japanese warriors, and then there's another typhoon that blows away their ships and sinks many of them, there is also a long-standing political and economic consequence for Japan, for the warrior government in Japan, of this defense. Another note is that you may be aware of this, the term kamikaze, the divine wind, it has its origin point in these Mongol invasions, because these storms that come and blow away the Mongol ships are called the winds of the gods, or the kamikaze, and this is famously the term the Japanese used for their suicide pilots, suicide bombers in World War II. They are the divine wind attempting to repel the Americans and other enemies in the Pacific theater of World War II. However, just one extra note on this: if you did read this book by Tom Conlon, In Little Need of Divine Intervention, the argument is, in fact, that these storms did not have that much significance in beating the Mongols, and that the Japanese had beaten the Mongols themselves, and that the storms were more insult to injury. However, we're getting off the track here, so I'm going to keep going just for a little bit longer, a couple more minutes here on the legacy of the Mongols. So the legacy of Pax Mongolica, or Pax Mongolica, is that of trade and transit and shifting cultures and shifting politics. And there's too much of it, it's too complicated to cover all of it in detail. But there is an interesting argument I'd like to share with you that is, not my argument, it's an argument multiple historians have put forward, but that a part of the rise of Europe in the period after the end of our course that really sees Europe come to predominate the world stage and take over places like the Americas, colonize chunks of Asia, and impose its will in places like China and Japan, and take over chunks of Africa. This rise of Europe may in part be caused by the Mongols, despite their, the spreading of the plague, because the Mongols depress a lot of the other regions that Europe was probably going to be competing with, for example, in the Middle East, and to a lesser extent in China. The Mongols take over China, but they don't necessarily slow its progress as much. But the argument that Europe ends up, beating out China is largely in part to the speed bump that the Mongols put in the way of Chinese progress, quote unquote. So there is this interesting argument that I'd at least like to mention. I don't really have a horse in this race. I don't know that I buy that argument or don't buy that argument, but it is an interesting one for you to think about if you're interested in the Mongols as a topic. Genghis Khan is a national figure, as we started out in this lecture in Mongolia today. This is a really amazing, gigantic statue, and there's a great kind of drone video of this thing here, which you can see. And I would really one day love to go stand on the head of Genghis Khan's horse. And you can look at that video more if you'd like on your own. But I'm going to wrap this up here. So my question to you for discussion is, were the Mongols a destructive force? Were they a productive, regenerative force in history? And in what ways? I want you to think about that a little bit and maybe talk about it in our discussion this week. For next time, we're going to talk about Africa and the Americas on the eve of European conquest. As we rapidly head toward the end of this course, we have a couple more lectures to go. I might end up combining a couple of the final lectures into one larger lecture because, number one, it will shorten them down a little bit so that you can focus on your final paper instead of having to watch just one more video. And number two, I want to kind of interlink some of these topics together a little bit better. So I might end up putting up like a week 11/week 12 final video here. I might do one more and then do a combined video after that. For Sunday, you have your student-led discussion on the Mongols and the Silk Road, as well as short response number 6, our last short response, yay, on Africa before European colonization. Also, perhaps a little bit on the Americas there too. I might, follow the lecture. But those are your projects to be working on going forward. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next time.